Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. The scope of the problem with the world. Over the last 2 weeks, many of us have been following the events in Ukraine. Notice how collectively our consciousness is monofocal. What do I mean by that? It's one thing or the other. Remember, for the last 2 years, we have been focusing our attention dramatically on COVID. Everything was about COVID. Now suddenly COVID is gone and the Ukraine is in the news. And if you go back, you'll find that this is the pattern. It's a pattern, in fact, that we live through, and we don't even notice we're doing it, but we do it. Now, part of this obviously has a lot to do with how each of us spends our time. I notice that some people don't pay any attention to the news at all, and so what's going on in Ukraine? They don't know. For other people, they're just aghast because, well, this is sort of how we're living today. But that's not the point of this sermon. The point is there's a problem with the world, and we always experience it as a problem. Well, if we stop and pause, we'll think, well, there are more problems, but a problem. Now, this was from a blog a few years back about how bad things are, and it runs through, I've used it in other sermons in the past, 1% of people are in prison, 2% are on probation, 1% are in a nursing home or hospice, 2% have dementia, 20% have chronic pain, 7% of people are depressed in any given year, 2% are cognitively disabled, 1% are schizophrenics. That's a big number. 20% are on food stamps, 1% are wheelchair bound, 7% are alcoholics. That's a big number. Now remember, these aren't exclusive. You might say, well, I only have one, I don't have the others. Lots of people have multiple, which means that there's other people without a lot of them. So you may or may not find yourself on this list. But even if you don't, if I would sit down and talk to you, how are you doing? You'd probably just say, fine. Then a few minutes later, no, really, what's going on? Well, and then out the story would come. Well, how do you know this? Well, I'm a pastor. This is what I do. I sit down with people, and they tell me about their problems, and I sit and listen and commiserate, pray, do a variety of other things. Say, oh, pastor, the world's so bad, and it's just getting worse. Well, that's not entirely true either. If you look at things like extreme poverty, the world is actually getting better at an enormously fast rate. 60, according at least to this one website, numbers vary. 62,000 people escaped extreme poverty today, while 12,000 fell into it. Now, obviously, depending if you're part of the 62,000 or the 12,000, you feel very different about the world, but that's a net gain of 50,000 people every day that escape extreme poverty. You might think, wow, there's 677 million people in extreme poverty in the world. Yeah, but there's almost 8 billion. And so that number's a lot smaller than you think. So is the world getting better? Is the world getting worse? Well, how on earth can we conceptualize the world? The world is fragile, though, as we're watching with war, and we feel it. Now, consciousness, again, is monofocal, and we tend to focus on the problems. And for the people in Judea and the Galilee during the time of the writings of the Gospels, many would say, what's the problem with the world? The Romans. The Romans are the problem with the world. Oh, okay. So Jesus, deliver us from the Romans, please. Isn't that what being a Messiah means? It means that you'll deliver us from the Romans. You'll save God's holy land and his holy people from the imperium of the Romans. But of course, the Romans, well, no, you have a lousy religion and you have a lousy culture, and we have a great religion and a great culture because we, of course, are on top of the world. And so if you had any brains at all, you'd give up on your God and your culture and you'd simply embrace ours. That's what the Romans think because, well, their validation is, in fact, that they are on top of the world. But what if you're blind? Well, maybe blindness is the problem. Or what if you're lame? Well, maybe my leg's not working is the problem. Well, what if you're hungry? Well, my stomach keeps saying there's a problem. What if you're leprous, living outside of town? So problems are all over the place. And if Jesus is going to be Savior, that salvation is going to have to span the scope of the problems. And so right there, we might begin to get a clue that if Jesus is going to be more than just a revolutionary Messiah to save first century Jews from Romans, this is going to be different. There's always a lot of world saving going on. So a number of months ago, when the problem was the pandemic, well, people are saying, well, once the pandemic is done, then we'll be ready to fix the world. We'll call it the Great Reset. Oh, wow. And there's all sorts of ideas of a better world, and most of us can think of betterment ways. If I had better health, better health is better than more illness. More money is better than less money. Better relationships are better than worse relationships. And most of these ideas are sort of engineering the things about our lives to make everything go more like we would want it to go. But if you sit back and you think about all of past betterments, you realize that there's often just a lot of trade-offs all along the way. And nobody told us that at the end of the pandemic there would be a war that would sort of push it out of the news. Oh, is it better? Now, a lot of this follows what would Jesus do? Well, and when we look at Jesus, we might think, well, I guess if you really wanted to make things better, you could teach them germ theory and tell them to boil the water and use latrines, and I'm sure that would help infant mortality and a whole bunch of health metrics in God's holy land and his holy people. I don't find a single verse about public sanitation in the Gospels. Well, what if Jesus gave them the formula to penicillin and basically gave the disciples a course in basic medicine and biology, and penicillin in the first century might have saved lives all along the way, but would that then have caused greater carbon footprint? So we imagine the solution is sort of always based around the problems. Well, what does the world need right now? Well, peace in the Ukraine. Well, yeah, that would be good. End of the pandemic. Well, what about rain in California? We didn't have the winter we were hoping we would have way back when the rain started in October. Haven't had much. Now in John 13, we're up to our third Passover. And if you remember, I've been telling you that Jesus is telling time with Passovers here. And so we're up to our third one. So it's just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave the world and to go to his Father. And it's like, well, wait a minute. The Romans are still in charge, and there's still lots of wars, and there's plenty of illness and sickness, and the world is still a mess. You can't leave now. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now, that sounds strange. To the end. To the end of time? We think in a very temporal way. What it means is he loved them to completion and to the conclusion. And it's like, well, he's been doing public ministry for 3 Passovers. I don't see how this completes anything. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now, I have read this passage all of my life, or it has been read to me when I was a little child, and so when I read John chapter 13, which is a fairly famous passage in the Bible, far more famous than many passages in the Hebrew scriptures. So I was just sort of glazed over this and never thought a lot about the Judas question. But then we had our men's Bible study this week, and people are always asking about Judas. And why did Judas do this? And the answer isn't really dealt with in a straightforward way in the Bible. And so we sort of speculate, but the connection is always with the devil, which actually sheds a little bit of light on this. Because remember that the devil tempted Jesus at the beginning of his ministry, and his temptations had a certain direction. His temptations were always in the direction of, well, make loaves into bread. So your appetites, Satan would use his appetites to tempt Jesus, have a little bit more comfort. And then the temptations seemed to be political. Bow down to me and I will deliver the nations to you. And also a religious show. jump off from the pinnacle of the temple, let everybody see your angelic power. And these are the temptations of the devil. So now the devil is prompting Judas. Why did Judas follow Jesus? Well, probably with everyone else that Jesus was going to make things better, and probably with everyone else thought that Jesus would make things better by getting rid of the Romans. Now, Peter, on their way down to Jerusalem, Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus applauds him for this answer. And then Jesus says, "And by the way, we're going down to Jerusalem, where I will be arrested and turned over to the hands of Gentiles and killed." And Peter stands up and says, "I'll never let that happen." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." So what is Satan's plan? It seems that on one hand, Jesus calls Peter Satan when he's trying to block this death of Jesus. And he's also entering into, that's what comes later in the Gospel of John, and tempting Judas to betray him. And it's like, well, does Satan want Jesus dead or not? And what exactly is the shape of the temptation that is going on with this, and how might this factor into Judas's plans? So it seems strange that now Satan would tempt Jesus to have Jesus kill, whereas before Peter saying, "Surely, Jesus, you're not going to die at the hands of the Gentiles," is "Get behind me, Satan." So did Judas not believe that if it came right down to it, Jesus wouldn't use his power to save his own life? Now, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us, but could this have been Judas's theory that I'm going to set up Jesus and I'm going to turn him over, and we're going to have a Hulk moment or a Captain America moment or an Iron Man moment, just like in all of our movies. And finally, when the hero's back is against the wall, suddenly it's Gandalf the White and soldiers fall over, and Jesus now is going to empty Minas Tirith of all the evil Romans. And was that Judas's plan? We don't really know. But maybe Judas could corner Jesus and provoke him to kill Romans and drive them out with a storm if they finally caught Jesus. I mean, they've been hunting Jesus all through the Gospel of John. And we found it just about every week when, they're trying to get Jesus. They're trying to get Jesus. And Jesus seems simply to elude them. And Judas is like, what if we really had him cornered? Then maybe it would happen. And Jesus would finally use his power to get the job done and resolve the Roman problem. And then the world would be saved. Now, this fits both with the temptations in the wilderness and with Peter's temptation, where Jesus wouldn't die. That's what Peter wants to avoid. And Jesus would display his power in a way that everybody is longing and hoping to resolve the Roman problem. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. This is sort of like getting ready for the moment of battle, and Iron Man takes off his super suit. What is Jesus doing? This is your plan to save the world? You're going to wash feet like a slave of the people that have been calling you master? I was expecting some political move or some antibiotic or some lesson on washing your hands and maybe wearing a mask or vaccinations maybe Jesus could give us, or something practical. We're looking for something political. We're looking for something miraculous. We're not expecting something against which there is no law. And we're expecting something that's going to be dramatic in a different way. Yeah, this is dramatic, but this is not the drama I was looking for. he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Peter understands a hierarchy. Peter understands those who are better and those who are worse. And Peter understands the drama and the liturgy that's supposed to play out. And he says, this is all wrong. Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing. Well, that much is clear. But later you will understand. Well, we hope so. No, says Peter. Peter's not up to learning anything. No, you shall never wash my feet. Is there a little Satan in Peter still? It's always Peter and Judas, isn't it, in these stories? And we sort of just always think of Peter as the good guy and Judas as the bad guy. But if you go through the stories, Peter keeps blocking Jesus, just like Judas does. They're sort of bookends of the disciples, and everybody else is probably in the middle. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part of me. Oh, that must have shocked him. Then, Lord, Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Okay, Peter. It's a little dramatic. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. Peter, this is symbolism here. And the reason you responded was because you understood that it's symbolism. So, yeah, your feet is enough. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone is clean. Now, this betrayal is interesting because on one hand, it's not sort of the wrong-headedness that gets Peter identified with Satan earlier, and it seems completely in keeping with the plan, but yet the actions and the motivation and what Judas will do will earn him the condemnation of all the gospel writers and everybody since then. Well, what is Judas trying to do? Now, neither Peter nor Judas understand what Jesus is trying to do. Peter gets called Satan when he tempts Jesus by saying, you shouldn't be put in jeopardy. And now Peter is saying, no, I'm not going to let you wash my feet. I understand the script. Jesus, you stay on top. I'll be your faithful lieutenant, and we'll go from Jerusalem onto Rome, and Jerusalem will rule the world just like the script is supposed to say, right? I've read the prophets. Satan enters into Judas. That's a little bit later. Now he's tempted. There's sort of a development in the text because he's going to betray Jesus. Well, what exactly is he betraying? Because this seems to be Jesus' plan. Jesus has already said the plan. So what exactly is he betraying? Somehow Peter and Judas are both, now we don't use the word betray for Peter, but he is in some ways acting to thwart Jesus' plan. That's what Jesus says. You don't have the ways of God in your mind. Well, what are the ways of God? Well, does Judas have the ways of God? No. But Judas is instrumental in the process, yes. But what is Judas trying to do? Judas doesn't have any idea what Jesus is going to do, even with his death. How is selling Jesus into the narrative that he has already told Peter about a betrayal? At least one Gnostic gospel interprets Judas as the hero. Jesus doesn't. The Gospels in the Bible don't. Now, a little bit earlier, there's a story where, this is actually the story in Matthew that prompted the discussion in the men's Bible study, where Mary anoints Jesus with an expensive ointment and Judas protests. And what we hear from Judas is that he's the money keeper and he helps himself in the till. So, yeah, Judas has some real issues. He loves money. He's a thief. And he liked to look like he was all about the poor, but he really wasn't. He was all about himself. And so this betrayal must, in fact, have something to do with that as well. But it's hard to imagine that this was just about the money. Because actually in the Gospel of Matthew, after Judas pulls this off, he tries to return the money. If it was just about the money, he wouldn't have cared what happened to Jesus. And in the Gospel of Matthew, he seems to care about what happened to Jesus. In fact, therefore, it seems to me that the betrayal that Judas is setting up by turning Jesus over at night in the park where the crowd can't respond, this is Judas's plan. And so Judas is imagining perhaps Jesus is going to do something and it's all going to happen. Something along the lines of the temptations that the devil did to Jesus at the beginning of the story. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to this place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am." So Peter, I understand why you resisted. "Now that I, your teacher and Lord, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet." What? But I thought the whole point of teachers and lords was that you don't have to do the foot washing. When I went to the Dominican Republic, I really didn't like having to sit on stage in those churches and be, the big missionary who eventually I had to learn that, no, they wanted me to play a role for their own sake and for their communities, and so I agreed. But the favorite thing of anything I did in the Dominican Republic was that when we came to communion, it always began with a foot washing ceremony. And I got to wash their feet. There's no greater honor that they gave to me than to give me their bare feet for me to wash. And in the Dominican Republic, their feet were quite remarkable. They were the feet of people who worked barefoot on hillsides. They were calloused. They were wounded. They were scarred. They were flat. And in my mind, I can still see their feet in my hands, and they let me wash them. I've set an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, there's the magnifier, we've talked about that before. No servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than anyone who sent him. In other words, the hierarchy's still there, and this story doesn't work without it. But this shows us what leadership is for. And it shows us that true leadership is sacrificial. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. The Spirit of Jesus is going to go out to renew the world through his disciples. And this is the means. What, antibiotics? What about sanitation? Well, sanitation and antibiotics are emblems of love, but love stands at the center. Now, what does Satan want? A big show. The miracles. The expedient way. When Peter says to Jesus to not go to Jerusalem, risking death, get behind me, Satan. And when Judas agrees to hand over Jesus for 30 pieces of silver to death, that's at Satan's prompting. Is Satan simplistic? Does Jesus know what he's doing? Peter is aghast at Jesus' way of saving. He's been doing it all along. His way has been love. And Jesus shows them in a completely contextual, appropriate, powerful way what love looks like. Something that's scalable. Something that can be applied every day in any relationship. Now, it's not always easy to know how to apply it every day in every relationship, but this is the tool by which the world is changed. Perhaps Judas likewise did not want Jesus' humiliation. No, I want a big show. I want the same thing that Satan asked for at the initial temptations. Show a big show, mobilize the people. Get them to all march for you and die for you. No, Jesus says, if anyone's blood is going to be shed, it's going to be mine. Perhaps Judas does not want Jesus' humiliation, but hopes for a display of divine power at the moment of Jesus' dangerous humiliation. And Jesus says, I will be humiliated for you. In alignment with the devil tempting Jesus in the wilderness, Judas acts. Judas, after Jesus does not use his divine power to save himself, will want to return the money. His plan in his eyes went horribly wrong. Satan's plan went horribly wrong for Satan too. This is the way the world is changed. It scales up to the very top and scales down to the very depth. It can be applied with science, with medicine, with government, with marriage, with children, the entire way. It's far better, far bigger than any great reset that someone might want to apply. It morphs and is complex because it adapts to every situation, even if we are not always sure what it must look like in every situation. We're bad at it, but Jesus has given it to us. Peter and Judas, neither of them get it. One will be restored and one will be lost. This is not the work of the great people with big ideas about how to remake everything. Well, they can use it too. In fact, that's what leadership is. If you're in charge, you should love those beneath you, and you should serve them as Jesus does by washing their feet. We've seen pharaohs and Caesars try to engineer a better world, but Jesus' plan scales down to every interaction. This is Christ's Spirit working through us, one-on-one, person-to-person, scalable, flexible, applicable, contextual, figuring out what loving and serving looks like every day. Amen.